Hey there, welcome to Mr.Cozy Bedtime True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The late summer air in Pensacola, Florida hung thick and warm on the morning of August 11th, 2023. It was a Friday, the kind of day that holds the quiet promise of a weekend ahead. For most people in the city, it was just another unremarkable day in August. But for 18-year-old Brooklyn Sims, it would be the last morning she would ever wake up. Brooklyn was, by every account, a young woman who had already shown the kind of quiet strength that some people take decades to develop. She was 18 years old and already a mother. Her daughter, just 2 years old, was the center of her world. Life had not handed Brooklyn the most comfortable of circumstances, but she faced it with her chin up. She was working as a contract employee at the Home Depot in Pensacola, earning an honest wage, building something step by step. She was a teenager navigating the enormous responsibility of motherhood, trying to hold her life together with the same hands that had only recently left childhood behind. She had no reason to believe that anything was wrong. She woke up that Friday morning and prepared for her shift. Her co-worker, a woman she knew, a woman she trusted, had offered to drive her to the store. That woman was Sheila Agee, 52 years old, who also worked at the same Home Depot as a contract employee. Sheila was the mother of Brooklyn's child's father, a young man named Keith Agee. Whatever complicated history existed between Brooklyn and the Agee family, the arrangement seemed ordinary enough that morning. Sheila pulled up, Brooklyn got in, and together they drove to work. Neither of them spoke of what was already in motion. About 90 miles away, in Alabama, Keith Agee was already coming apart. Keith was 20 years old, young, impulsive, and that morning, consumed by a fury he could barely contain. Earlier that day, he had received a phone call with the results of a medical test. The test had come back positive for a sexually transmitted disease. In the volatile chemistry of Keith's mind, the calculation was immediate and devastating in its simplicity. He had recently been with Brooklyn. She was the mother of his child, and therefore, in his mind, she must have been the one who gave it to him. He did not pause to consider other possibilities. He did not stop to ask questions or seek out a conversation. He did not think of their daughter, barely old enough to speak in full sentences, who would one day need both her parents. He simply decided, with the cold certainty of a man surrendering entirely to his rage, that Brooklyn Sims had to pay. What happened next, the sequence of decisions made in the hours that followed, is what transforms this story from a tragedy into something even more deeply disturbing. Because Keith Agee did not act alone, and the person who helped him was the one person who, by every natural law of love and decency, should have stopped him. He texted his mother. The text messages between Keith and Sheila Agee. Keith told his mother what he was planning to do. He told her he was going to go to the Home Depot. He told her he intended to kill Brooklyn. And Sheila Agee, his mother, a grown woman, 52 years old, who had that very morning driven Brooklyn to work, did not try to stop him. She did not call the police. She did not warn Brooklyn, who was standing just feet from her inside that store. Instead, according to the text exchanges, she provided Keith with Brooklyn's location. She told him where Brooklyn was and when would be the right time to come. In one message that would become central to the prosecution's case, Sheila sent words that prosecutors described as encouragement, essentially daring her son to follow through with the killing, taunting him that he was less of a man if he did not. While his mother was inside the store, standing alongside the young woman she had driven there herself, Keith Agee left his workplace in Alabama. He went home, walked inside, and retrieved a 9mm handgun. He got back in his car and drove toward Pensacola. For 90 minutes, he traveled down the highway with a weapon in his waistband and murder in his heart, texting back and forth with his mother the entire way, the two of them coordinating the details of what was about to happen. 90 minutes. 90 minutes in which Brooklyn Sims stood at her workstation, entirely unaware that death was heading toward her at highway speed. Inside the Home Depot on that Friday afternoon, the store carried on as retail environments do. The familiar sounds of carts rolling across polished floors, the distant whir of a forklift, customers wandering through wide aisles stacked with lumber and light fixtures. Brooklyn was doing her job. Her co-workers moved around her, and somewhere nearby, Sheila Agee moved too, knowing what was coming, saying nothing. Keith Agee arrived at the store and walked inside. He found Brooklyn. He felt calm when he first saw her. In that initial moment, his rage had subsided. But then he approached her and confronted her about the STD test, about his belief that she had wronged him. And when Brooklyn turned away from him, unwilling to engage with a confrontation she may have sensed was already beyond reason, something inside Keith broke entirely. He drew the gun. In the middle of a busy retail store, on an ordinary Friday afternoon in August, Keith Agee opened fire on Brooklyn Sims. He fired 7 shots. Several found their mark. Co-workers screamed and scattered. 2 other employees were struck by gunfire during the chaos, injured, though they survived. Brooklyn did not. She was hit multiple times. The medical examiner, who later testified at trial, described multiple gunshot wounds. Brooklyn Sims, 18 years old, mother of a 2-year-old girl, fell inside the Home Depot where she had arrived just hours before in the passenger seat of her killer's mother's car. She died at the scene. The aftermath was an eruption of sirens and grief. Law enforcement arrived to find a crime scene unlike most. A public shooting in broad daylight, inside a major retail store, with surveillance cameras positioned throughout and a store full of witnesses. From the earliest hours of the investigation, detectives had an extraordinary amount to work with. They had the cameras, they had the witnesses, they had the phones, and almost immediately they had the texts. When investigators obtained the messages between Keith Agee and his mother, the picture that emerged was comprehensive and damning. The text showed the progression of a murder plot assembled in real time. Keith announcing his intention, Sheila responding, the two of them discussing timing and logistics while Brooklyn was alive and present and completely unaware. Detectives found no evidence that Sheila had attempted to stop her son or warn the victim. They found the opposite. Keith Agee was arrested and charged with first-degree premeditated murder and 2 counts of aggravated battery for the injuries sustained by his co-workers. He did not flee, did not disappear. The combination of surveillance footage, witness accounts, and the digital record of his messages meant that any attempt at denial would have been useless. Shortly after, investigators turned their attention to Sheila Agee. Her arrest warrant described the same cold logic that the text messages had documented. She had known, she had enabled, and she had done nothing to prevent the death of a young woman who had trusted her enough to get into her car that morning. Sheila Agee was arrested and charged as a principal to first-degree premeditated murder, a charge that, under Florida law, carries the same weight as if she had pulled the trigger herself. For Brooklyn's family and friends, the weeks that followed her death were marked by a grief almost impossible to articulate. A vigil was held, attended by those who had known and loved her. People who gathered not just to mourn, but to remind a stunned community that the young woman killed inside that store had been real, had been full of life, had been more than a name in a news headline. Her daughter, still too young to fully understand what had happened, would grow up with only fragments, photographs, stories, the memories of those who had known her mother. The criminal cases moved through the courts. Keith Agee went to trial in December 2023. Prosecutors laid out the evidence. The texts, the purchase of a firearm, the 90-minute drive from Alabama, the witnesses inside the store. Keith's defense team attempted a somewhat different argument, suggesting that while he had undeniably fired the shots, he had not truly planned to kill Brooklyn when he first walked in, that the decision had been made in a flash of emotion when she turned away from him, not premeditated in the legal sense. The jury rejected that argument. The evidence of premeditation was simply too overwhelming. A man who texts his mother about his plans, drives 90 minutes with a loaded weapon, and enters a specific store to find a specific person does not do so on impulse. Keith Agee was found guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was 20 years old. He would never again be free. And then came the cruelest twist of all. The detail that, when revealed, silenced courtrooms and broke hearts all over again. Brooklyn Sims did not give Keith Agee a sexually transmitted disease. The medical examination conducted after her death included STD testing, and the results were definitive. Brooklyn was clean. She had nothing. Keith had contracted the disease from someone else entirely. Some other encounter, some other relationship he had failed to account for. He had murdered the mother of his child, destroyed 2 lives and shattered a family, based on an assumption he never once thought to question. He never gave Brooklyn the chance to speak. He never asked her directly. He simply decided she was guilty, armed himself, and drove. Brooklyn never even knew what she was being accused of. The legal proceedings against Sheila Agee took longer. Her first trial, in November 2024, ended in a mistrial when juror issues rendered the proceedings invalid. A legal procedural collapse that sent Brooklyn's family back to the beginning, forced to wait once more for the justice they had been promised. It is a particular cruelty of the legal system that families of victims must sometimes endure this, to sit through a trial, to relive the worst moments imaginable in graphic detail, and then to be told to come back and do it again. They came back. Sheila Agee's second trial began in August 2025. Over 3 days, the jury heard the same devastating evidence that investigators had assembled. The text messages, the timeline, the fact that Sheila had driven Brooklyn to work that very morning, had sat beside her in a car, had known what was coming, and had said nothing. Prosecutors argued powerfully and directly that Sheila Agee had not merely failed to prevent the murder. She had actively participated in making it happen. She had provided her son with Brooklyn's location. She had, in her own written words, encouraged him. She was not a helpless bystander. She was a conspirator. Both Sheila and Keith testified in their own defense during the second trial. Keith took the stand and claimed, remarkably, that his mother had never truly wanted him to hurt Brooklyn, that her messages had been misunderstood, that she loved Brooklyn. It was a story that strained credulity against the cold, clear language of the texts themselves. Sheila denied that her messages constituted encouragement, that she had meant something different, that she too had not fully believed Keith would go through with it. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Sheila Agee was found guilty of principle to first-degree premeditated murder. She was 52 years old. She received the mandatory minimum sentence, life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Mother and son would now both spend the rest of their lives behind bars. A family unit that had, in the span of a single morning's worth of text messages, conspired to end the life of an 18-year-old girl. What lingers about the case of Brooklyn Sims is not simply the horror of the crime itself, though that horror is profound and real. It is the layers of betrayal woven through every moment of the story. Brooklyn was betrayed by the father of her child, who chose a gun over a conversation. She was betrayed by a woman old enough to be her mother, who drove her to the door of her own death and stayed silent while her son drove toward it. She was betrayed by the terrible randomness of a medical result that was not even accurate, an assumption formed in fury and never corrected, because Brooklyn was never given the chance to speak. She was 18 years old. She had a daughter who still needed her. She had a whole life she had barely begun to live, a future that belonged to her and to no one else, until someone took it, violently and without justification, in the middle of a retail store on a Friday afternoon. Brooklyn Sims is remembered by those who loved her as someone full of life and warmth, a young mother doing her best with what she had, facing the world with a resilience far beyond her years. Her daughter will grow up knowing her mother's name, knowing the story, knowing that the people responsible have been held accountable, and carrying always the weight of a love she deserved to have for a lifetime, but was allowed only 2 years. Justice was eventually served. But justice, as those closest to Brooklyn know far better than any courtroom can express, does not bring anyone back. It does not undo the morning of August 11th, 2023, or restore what was taken from a little girl who still needed her mother. All it can do, all it ever can do, is bear witness to the truth of what happened and declare, in the clearest possible terms, that Brooklyn Sims mattered. She mattered. She was real. And she deserved so much better than the world gave her in the end. Story 2. The Florida sun had barely begun its descent when silence fell over Tamarack Village Apartments on July 13th, 2022. It was an ordinary Wednesday afternoon in the kind of quiet suburban complex where neighbors nodded hello at the mailbox and children played in the courtyards. Nobody could have anticipated that, inside one of those apartments, a young woman's life had already been taken. Her future stolen by someone she had never truly wronged, erased by a jealousy that had quietly been building for months, hundreds of miles away in New York City. Her name was Kayla Hodgson. She was 23 years old. Kayla was the kind of person who lit up whatever room she walked into. Friends and family described her as vibrant, warm, and endlessly caring. Someone who had a passion for fashion, who could quote episodes of The Office from memory, and whose laughter was the sort that made others feel instantly at ease. She worked as a bottle girl and waitress in South Florida's entertainment scene, a job that demanded charm and endurance in equal measure, both of which Kayla had in abundance. She was young, she was building her life, and she was happy. She had recently begun dating a man she cared about deeply, a man whose name, in the weeks and months ahead, would become inseparable from the story of her death. His name was Revelto Robinson, known to those close to him as Terry. He and Kayla had found each other, and to those watching from the outside, it looked like a relationship blossoming naturally, the way good things sometimes do. But what Kayla may not have fully understood, what perhaps nobody adequately warned her about, was that Terry's past had not yet let him go. Back in New York City, a woman named Sakina Thompson was watching. Thompson, 31 years old, had been in a relationship with Terry before Kayla entered the picture. When that relationship ended and Terry moved on, something inside Thompson did not move with it. She became consumed by what she could not have. She tracked Terry's movements obsessively, installing a GPS tracker on his Range Rover, a device that silently fed her information about where he was, when he arrived, and how long he stayed. She checked his location dozens of times a day, capturing screenshots when he visited unfamiliar addresses, building a digital picture of a life she felt had been taken from her. When the tracker began leading repeatedly to the Tamarack Village Apartments in South Florida, Thompson knew. Terry was seeing someone, and when she discovered it was Kayla, a young, beautiful woman who worked in clubs and had blocked Thompson on social media, the already smoldering fire inside her raged into something far more dangerous. Being blocked was, to Thompson, not just a social snub. It was a declaration, a door slammed in her face, and she was not willing to accept it. What happened next was not a moment of passion. It was not the spontaneous combustion of an overwhelmed heart. It was something far colder and far more deliberate. Thompson began to plan. In the days leading up to July 13th, 2022, she went shopping. Store receipts would later tell the story her silence could not. She purchased gloves, dark clothing, and a knife. She researched Kayla's address and wrote it down by hand, apartment number included, on a folded piece of paper she tucked into her purse. She created a fake Uber account under an assumed identity, a digital disguise to accompany the physical one she was assembling. She booked a one-way flight from New York to Fort Lauderdale. A one-way ticket. She was not planning to come back the same person who left. In the early hours of July 13th, 2022, while much of Tamarack still slept, Sakina Thompson landed in South Florida. She was dressed carefully, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over her forehead, a COVID-19 mask covering the lower half of her face, dark gloves pulled over her hands. On surveillance footage from neighboring buildings, she is an unsettling figure, moving through a residential complex in full disguise in the dead of summer, when the Florida heat makes such clothing almost unbearable. But Thompson did not seem to care about comfort. She had a purpose. Using her fake Uber account, she had traveled to Tamarack Village Apartments. Security footage captured her entering the complex at approximately 12:45 in the morning, slipping inside by following another resident through the door, a common and deceptively simple way to bypass locked building entrances. She moved through the hallways and found Kayla's door. What happened inside that apartment belongs to the realm of forensic evidence and courtroom testimony, but the outlines are harrowing. The medical examiner would later determine that Kayla suffered dozens of stab wounds. The attack was ferocious and relentless. There were no significant defensive wounds on Kayla's hands or arms, suggesting she had either been taken completely by surprise or incapacitated before she could fight back. The murder weapon, a sharp, single-edged blade approximately 6 inches in length, was never recovered. Investigators believe Thompson disposed of it somewhere between the crime scene and the airport. Kayla Hodgson died sometime between 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning of July 13, 2022. She was 23 years old, with her whole life ahead of her. But Thompson was not done. In the stunned, horrifying moments after taking Kayla's life, she did not flee in panic. Instead, she did something that would later chill the jury that heard her case. She began to clean. She attempted to wipe away evidence of the attack. Then, with a deliberateness that still stuns investigators, she changed out of her own blood-soaked clothes and put on Kayla's. She walked out wearing the garments of the woman she had just killed. She then contacted Terry, who was waiting at a nearby shopping center. Together, the two of them boarded a flight back to New York, on the very same day Kayla's life had been taken. It was a neighbor who discovered her, at approximately 3 o'clock that afternoon. A frantic 911 call broke the quiet of the apartment complex. The caller's voice was trembling as they described what they had found. Within minutes, Broward County Sheriff's deputies swarmed the scene, their vehicle lights strobing against the walls of the building. Inside Kayla's apartment, they found a young woman who had been viciously attacked and left to die. What they found also told a story. The scene showed signs of an attempt to clean it, clothing was missing, and the victim had been left without dignity in the aftermath of an act of profound violence. Detectives moved quickly. From the earliest hours of the investigation, certain details stood out with cold clarity. The surveillance footage showed a disguised figure entering the complex. The timing of the attack corresponded with GPS data that investigators later obtained. The fake Uber account created a digital breadcrumb trail. And within Kayla's apartment, in the midst of the cleaned-up crime scene, there was still evidence, partial footprints, traces of blood that matched the tread pattern of shoes later found in a New York apartment, and a partial fingerprint on the bathroom door frame that did not belong to Kayla or any authorized visitor. Detectives also obtained Terry's phone records. What they found was a digital archive of his relationship with Kayla. Hundreds of messages, late-night conversations, travel plans. And through those records, and through the GPS tracker data that Thompson had used so obsessively against Terry, investigators were able to build a detailed reconstruction of the hours leading up to the murder. The tracker had recorded Thompson's patterns. Dozens of location checks per day, screenshots of Terry's movements, the repeated visits to Tamarack Village Apartments flagged in the data. It was a portrait of obsession, preserved in digital amber. Most damning of all was the handwritten note found in Thompson's possession, Kayla's address, her apartment number, written in Thompson's own hand. There was no innocent explanation for it. It was a target. It was a destination. It was proof of premeditation. On the morning of August 3, 2022, a tactical team surrounded a building in New York City. Detectives knocked on Sakina Thompson's door, identified themselves, and Thompson opened it. She surrendered without resistance, reportedly appearing unsurprised by their arrival, as though she had always known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that this moment was coming. Inside her apartment, investigators found clothing that matched witness descriptions, with traces of blood later confirmed to belong to Kayla Hodgson. They found the folded note with Kayla's address. They documented everything. Thompson was booked into Rikers Island and charged with first-degree murder. She waived her right to an extradition hearing in New York, expediting her transfer to Florida custody. On August 10, 2022, she arrived in handcuffs at Fort Lauderdale Hollywood International Airport, escorted by Broward County Sheriff's deputies as news cameras recorded her arrival. The wheels of justice had begun to turn. The trial that followed was more than 3 years in the making. Defense motions and changes in legal representation caused repeated delays, stretching the case through years of waiting, years that Kayla's family endured while her killer remained in the legal system. When the trial finally arrived, Sakina Thompson took the extraordinary step of testifying in her own defense. On the witness stand, she described entering Kayla's apartment and claimed that Kayla had attacked her with a piece of glass from a hookah pipe, slashing her across the stomach. She told the jury she had blacked out, only to regain consciousness and find herself standing in Kayla's blood. She claimed she had acted in self-defense, that she feared for herself and for the baby she was carrying. Thompson was pregnant at the time of the killing. The prosecution dismantled this account piece by piece. Prosecutors described Thompson as jealous and insecure, a woman who had traveled more than 1,000 miles with a single predetermined purpose. They presented the flight records, the fake Uber account, the disguise, the purchased gloves and knife, the GPS tracking data, the handwritten note with Kayla's address, and the forensic evidence connecting Thompson to the scene. They presented the medical examiner's findings, dozens of stab wounds on Kayla's body, evidence of an attack that was not the product of a blackout or a sudden panic, but of sustained, directed violence. They asked the jury a simple but devastating question. If Thompson had simply blacked out and acted in self-defense, why did she change into Kayla's clothes? Why did she try to clean the crime scene? Why did she board a flight back to New York on the same day? Why did she have Kayla's address written in her own handwriting before she ever left New York? Self-defense, the prosecution argued, does not come prepared with gloves and a knife and a handwritten map to the victim's home. On October 15, 2025, a Broward County jury returned their verdict after more than 3 years of waiting. Guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through a packed courtroom. For Kayla's family, who had spent more than 3 years holding their grief alongside the uncertainty of whether justice would ever arrive, the word meant something profound and complicated. Grief does not evaporate with a verdict, but justice, at least, had been served. Kayla's family spoke to reporters after the verdict. Her mother, Cory Hodgson, said the outcome brought the family some peace, knowing justice has been served. Other relatives expressed gratitude that the jury had been able to see the case for what it truly was. Not a self-defense situation, not an accident, not a moment of chaos, but a deliberate act carried out against a young woman who had done nothing to deserve it. Kayla did not deserve to die the way that she did, her family said. In the weeks that followed the conviction, Sakina Thompson stood before a judge once more. The sentence handed down was the maximum the law allowed: life in prison without the possibility of parole. She will spend the remainder of her days behind bars, the full weight of what she did rendered permanent in the language of the justice system. Kayla Hodgson was 23 years old when she died. She loved fashion. She loved the office. She was vibrant and warm and full of life, the kind of person who made the world feel a little brighter just by being in it. She was someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone's light. She was building a life in South Florida, dreaming the ordinary dreams that belong to young people in the early chapters of adulthood. She did not ask for any of what came to her. She did not provoke it. She did not deserve it. She simply existed, laughed, worked, loved, and lived, until someone else's obsession made that existence feel like an offense too great to endure. The case of Kayla Hodgson is not simply a story of crime and punishment. It is a story about what happens when obsession is allowed to fester unchecked, when jealousy curdles into something monstrous, when a human being is reduced in another person's mind to nothing more than an obstacle. It is a story about the terrible and irreversible price of hatred. And it is, above all, a story about a 23-year-old woman who deserved to grow old and never got the chance. Story 3. The town of Bury Street, Edmonds, sits like a postcard in the heart of Suffolk, England, a cathedral town of cobbled streets, medieval architecture, and quiet market squares that hum with an almost ancient stillness after midnight. On most Saturday mornings, the town barely stirs before dawn. But on the 24th of September, 2016, something happened in one of its dark, narrow-service alleyways that would shatter a family, consume millions in public resources, and leave an entire nation asking a question that has never fully been answered. Where is Cory McKe? Cory McKe was born on the 16th of September, 1993 in Perth, Scotland, though he spent most of his childhood growing up in Dunfermline, Fife, a proud, hard-working town nestled between the hills of Scotland and the Firth of Forth. He was the eldest of 3 brothers, raised alongside Darragh and McKe by their mother, Nicola Urquhart, after their parents separated when Cory was just 9 years old. For a young boy, the dissolution of a family carries a weight that sits quietly in the chest, unseen by the world but never quite forgotten. Cory was, by all accounts, a boy full of life, the kind of person who could walk into a room and immediately make it warmer. His father, Martin McKe, would later say, simply and honestly, he could walk into a room and light it up. He was charming, funny, and restless in the way that only the most spirited young men are. His family called him a lovable rogue who loved to socialize and party, and those who knew him well would never dispute that description. But beneath the easy grin and the social magnetism, Cory carried wounds. When he was 15 years old, a female friend died on a railway line. That grief, sharp and incomprehensible to a teenager still learning what it meant to lose someone, opened a door that he found increasingly difficult to close. Over the years that followed, alcohol became both his social armor and his vulnerability, a companion to the loud Friday nights and a crutch during the quieter ones. He was never aggressive, with or without alcohol. He was simply someone who drank too much, too fast, and too often, something those who loved him worried about, but something that did not define him. In 2013, at 19 years old, Cory joined the Royal Air Force Regiment. There is something romantic about the idea of a young Scottish man enlisting, stepping away from the small tensions of his youth and towards something larger than himself. He was trained and eventually posted to No. 2 Squadron RAF Regiment at RAF Honington, a base nestled into the flat, quiet landscape of Suffolk, about 10 miles northeast of Bury Street, Edmonds. He became a senior aircraft man, a gunner and medic, and despite what a former line manager once described as him being a nightmare on the drink, he served, he worked, and he had a life ahead of him. Then, in the spring of 2016, Cory met a young woman named April Oliver through a dating website. They had been together only 5 months when the world changed for both of them, though April would not discover the full weight of that change until the following January. The weekend of the 23rd of September, 2016 was an ordinary one for the young men and women stationed at RAF Honington. Cory had the weekend off, and like many 23-year-olds with a rare break from duty, he planned to make the most of it. He drove his car into Bury Street, Edmonds with a group of friends, intending to leave it parked overnight and enjoy a night out on the town. April Oliver, his girlfriend, was away on holiday in the United States at the time. He had been texting his brother Darragh that evening, making plans to meet up later. His last text message, sent at 3:08 in the morning, was light and casual, the text of a young man without a care in the world, tapping a message into his phone in the small hours. The night unfolded the way many do. Cory and his friends moved through the town's bars and clubs, the alcohol flowing freely, the conversation loud and full of laughter. At some point during the night, he ended up at Flex, a nightclub on St. Andrew Street South. He was eventually asked to leave. The doorman who spoke to him later recalled that Cory was too drunk to stay inside, but that he had been absolutely no trouble. They had a pleasant conversation on the pavement outside, and then Cory moved on. That was the version of Cory McKe that almost everyone knew. Harmless, cheerful, drunk. Between 1:15 and 1:30 in the morning, CCTV footage captured him inside Mamma Mia's, a takeaway restaurant on the high street that he reportedly visited regularly on his nights out. He ate, he wandered. Somewhere in the next 2 hours, Cory sat down in a doorway on Brentgovell Street and fell asleep. It would not have been unusual behavior for him. Cory had been known to fall asleep in all manner of unusual places when he had been drinking heavily. He had, on at least one previous occasion, slept in the back of a commercial bin, pulling bin bags over himself like a blanket. He was, they all agreed, a very heavy sleeper when drunk. At 3:25 in the morning, a CCTV camera mounted on a building on Brentgovell Street captured the last confirmed image of Cory McKe. He was wearing a pink shirt, slightly disheveled from the long night, and he was walking with the slow, wandering purpose of someone following an instinct rather than a plan. He turned into a cul-de-sac area just off the street, a service area known locally as the Horseshoe, a small, enclosed loading bay lined with large commercial waste bins used by the local businesses. The camera never captured him coming out. Because Cory had the weekend off, nobody raised an alarm immediately. He was a young man who often lost his phone or his wallet on a night out. He had slept in strange places before. His friends assumed he had found his way home somehow. It was not until Monday, the 26th of September, when Cory McKe failed to report for work at RAF Honington, that anyone in a position of authority registered his absence. Suffolk police began their investigation, and the Suffolk Lowland Search and Rescue Team fanned out across the streets of Berry Street, Edmonds, and the roads leading back to the base. Volunteers joined officers on foot patrols. Helicopters swept the fields and hedgerows between the town and the airbase. The case attracted attention first locally, then nationally, as the image of a young, smiling RAF gunner from Scotland was shared across social media platforms. A campaign called Find Cory gathered momentum, and supporters who called themselves Cory's Army spread his name to every corner of the country and beyond. His mother, Nicola Urquhart, stood before television cameras with a composure that must have cost her everything she had, and she appealed for information. "People don't just disappear," she said, her Scottish accent steady and resolute. "That just doesn't happen. Somebody knows something. Somebody has got some information about where he's gone." But the days became weeks, and the weeks became months, and the silence remained. The most significant clue in the entire investigation was also its most haunting. Cory's Nokia Lumia mobile phone, which had been in his pocket when he walked into the Horseshoe area, was tracked through mobile phone masts in the hours that followed his disappearance. What the data revealed was extraordinary and, for his family, devastating. On the morning of September 24th, his phone moved from Berry Street, Edmonds to a location near Barton Mills, a village approximately 12 miles to the northwest, along the A1101 road. The journey, according to the phone data, took 28 minutes. It was physically impossible for a person to have made that journey on foot in that time. Whoever, or whatever, was carrying that phone had been moving in a vehicle. Police cross-referenced the phone's route with the movements of the commercial waste lorries that had collected rubbish from the Horseshoe area in the early hours of that morning. The route matched, precisely, the path taken by a Biffa waste lorry that had emptied the bins in that service area and driven its load to the Barton Mills area. The phone's signal went dark at 8 o'clock in the morning, either switched off, destroyed, or crushed into silence. Investigators turned their attention to the waste lorry. The driver was interviewed. He stated that he had checked inside the bin before tipping it, standard procedure, and had not seen anyone. But the mechanics of what was in the bin told a different story. When police asked Biffa, the waste management company, for the registered weight of the bin that had been collected from the Horseshoe area, the figure given was a paltry 15 kilograms, barely 33 pounds. That weight made it almost impossible for a grown man to have been inside. Cory weighed approximately 90 kilograms. Police, working on the figures they had been given, initially hesitated to commit to a full search of the landfill site where the lorry had eventually deposited its load. Then, in March 2017, everything changed. 6 months after Cory vanished, a review of the weight data from the Biffa lorry revealed that the figure of 15 kilograms had been a catastrophic error. The actual weight carried in the bin on the morning of September 24th was 116 kilograms, more than 250 pounds. The weight was entirely consistent with a grown adult having been inside. And there was something else, something that made the blood run cold. The device used to record the bin weights had been returned to its factory default settings on the 1st of February, 2017, the day before police collected it as evidence. The officers involved considered this development highly suspicious. Whether it was an accident or something deliberate has never been conclusively determined. When the corrected weight was made public, Cory's mother posted on Facebook with a simple, raw grief that captured exactly what the news meant. "This can really devastatingly only mean one thing," she wrote. Police announced that they would begin searching the landfill site at Milton, in Cambridgeshire, where the bin lorry had eventually deposited its load. The scale of the undertaking was staggering. The search was planned to cover more than 1,000 square yards, to a depth of 25 feet. Officers and specialists began the slow, laborious work of sifting through tons of compacted rubbish, looking for any trace of a young man who had last been seen walking into a bin loading bay in the early hours of an autumn morning. The landfill search became one of the most emotionally grueling episodes in recent British missing persons history. Over the months that followed, workers sifted through more than 6,500 tons of waste. A human skull was found at the site in April 2017, briefly electrifying the investigation, only to be identified as belonging to a female who had died before 1945. Bones found at a nearby incineration facility were investigated and ruled out. Every fragment, every piece of cloth, every item that might have belonged to a young man was examined with painstaking care. In July 2017, Suffolk police announced they were suspending the landfill search. Cory's father, Martin McKe, drove his camper van to the entrance of the landfill site and parked it there, blocking access, in a desperate and heartbreaking attempt to stop the authorities from moving on. "I want them to continue to look for my son," he said. "All the facts, all the evidence, lies at this landfill site." Nicola Urquhart threatened legal action, an injunction to prevent the site from being disturbed. She had never accepted the police theory, could not reconcile herself to the image of her proud, appearance-conscious son choosing to sleep in a rubbish bin when his car was parked nearby. She continued to suggest the possibility of third-party involvement, pointing to unresolved questions about CCTV coverage and the mysterious weight discrepancy. In October 2017, a second search began at a nearby section of the same landfill site, in an area believed to contain waste from the correct time period. By December 2017, the total cost of the investigation had exceeded €1.2 million. By January 2018, it had climbed to €2.1 million, making Operation Phonetic, as the case was formally known, the most expensive Suffolk police investigation in a decade. In March 2018, Suffolk police formally stood down their active inquiry. Unless any new, realistic, and credible information becomes available, their statement read, "Then the investigation is complete." While the investigation ground on, and the searches came and went, life in its most tender form continued. In January 2017, for months after Cory disappeared, his girlfriend April Oliver made an announcement. She was pregnant. She had discovered she was carrying Cory's child after she had cut her holiday in the United States short and returned to Britain when news of his disappearance reached her. Neither she nor Cory had known about the pregnancy when he walked out into that September night. On the 11th of June, 2017, a little girl was born. April named her Ellie Louise and gave her the middle name Cory, a small, permanent thread connecting a daughter to the father she would never meet. Years later, when his mother spoke about her son's legacy, it was Ellie she described first and most warmly. The spit of her dad, she said, being raised to know who he was, with his humor, with his spirit. Years passed. The case was never forgotten, though it faded from the daily headlines. In November 2020, following a request from the family, it was announced that a full inquest would be conducted into Cory McKe's death. The inquest opened on the 7th of March, 2022 at Suffolk Coroner's Court in Ipswich and lasted 2 weeks, during which a jury of 5 men and 5 women heard evidence about the last hours of his life, the movement of his phone, the weight of the bin, the behavior of the lorry, and the long, exhausting years of investigation that followed. Investigators presented 4 possible theories about what had happened to Cory. The evidence, however, pointed overwhelmingly in one direction. Analysis of the bin weight data confirmed that the load on the morning of September 24th was anomalously high, far above the average for that route during the entire preceding year. The phone data mapped precisely onto the lorry's route. There was no CCTV footage of Cory leaving the horseshoe area on foot. He had slept in bins before. He had been described as virtually impossible to wake when he had been drinking. He had been observed asleep in a doorway earlier that same morning, before stirring and walking deeper into the night. A pathologist told the jury that had Cory climbed into the bin and been tipped into the back of the lorry, he would likely have died within minutes. The lorry was fitted with a compactor, a crushing mechanism that compresses waste as it is loaded. 10.8 tons of waste moved through that lorry that morning, eventually compacted to the density of a small, dense block. There was no survival. The pathologist gave a 5% chance of survival, and that fraction dissolved entirely in the face of everything else. The jury returned its verdict in less than a single day. Cory McKe died at approximately 4:20 in the morning on the 24th of September, 2016, in Berry Street, Edmonds, as a result of compression asphyxia in association with multiple injuries. His death had been contributed to by impaired judgment due to alcohol consumption. The jury also noted ineffective locks on the bins, an insufficient check of the bin before it was tipped, and poor visibility through the viewing window on the lorry, all of which, in combination, had allowed a preventable tragedy to unfold in the pre-dawn darkness of an English market town. Cory McKe was formally and legally declared dead. His body has never been found. It lies compressed, dispersed, irretrievable, somewhere within the layers of a landfill site in Cambridgeshire, beneath years of waste and the slow churn of time. For Nicola Urquhart, the inquest brought something she had spent nearly 6 years aching for. Not her son, not the one thing that could never be returned, but an answer. She left the court saying that she believed, 100%, in the jury's conclusion. As a family, we've now all walked out of there with a huge weight lifted off our shoulders, she said, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had carried a terrible burden for a very long time. Cory's father said simply that he hoped his son could finally be left to rest in peace. Beyond a family's grief and a little girl named Ellie Louise was a set of urgent questions about safety, about the locks on commercial bins, about the procedures waste lorry drivers follow before tipping, about the visibility afforded by those small perspex windows through which a driver is expected to check that no living person is inside. The coroner ordered prevention of future death reports to be sent to the Container Handling Equipment Manufacturers Association and to BIFA. Small administrative letters addressed to companies, written in the dry language of coroner's law, in memory of a 23-year-old boy from Dunfermline who lit up every room he walked into and died alone in the dark. Story 4. Bristol is a city that knows how to keep its secrets. Its streets wind and fold over one another, climbing hills and dipping into valleys, lined with Victorian terraces and the quiet domesticity of ordinary lives. In the St. George district, one of those quiet corners of the city, stood a red brick house on Crown Hill, an entirely unremarkable address, indistinguishable from 100 others nearby. A family home, a place of school runs and Sunday dinners and the small, daily rhythms that people never think to appreciate until they are gone. It was inside this house that 16-year-old Rebecca Watts, known to everyone who loved her simply as Becky, lived with her father, Darren Galsworthy, and his wife, Angela. She was a teenager in the fullest sense of the word, fond of music, devoted to her friends, prone to the ordinary turbulence of adolescence, and entirely full of the kind of quiet, unrealized potential that belongs to people who have barely begun. Photographs of Becky show a small, dark-haired girl with bright eyes and a smile that seemed to hold something warm and private, as though the very best of her was always just a moment away from surfacing. She was not a complicated young woman. She did not have powerful enemies. She had not done anything to deserve what was about to happen to her. What she had, without knowing it, was a stepbrother who had decided she was a target. His name was Nathan Matthews. Nathan Matthews was 28 years old in February 2015, a full 12 years older than Becky, a man fully grown while she was still a child navigating the sharp edges of teenage life. He was Anja's son from a previous relationship, which made Becky his stepsister by the marriage of their parents, though the two had never been particularly close. Matthews was wiry and intense, the kind of person who could sit in a room and say very little while the thing behind his eyes remained entirely private. He lived with his girlfriend, Shauna Hoare, 21 years old and pregnant, at a terraced house on Cotton Mill Lane in Barton Hill, about a mile and a half from Becky's home on Crown Hill. On the surface, the Galsworthy household was an ordinary blended family managing the ordinary complications of step-siblings and shared living. But beneath that surface, something had been growing in Nathan Matthews that nobody around him fully understood. That Matthews had developed an obsession, a fixation, with petite teenage girls. Matthews and Hoare had, at some point, formed a shared attraction to the idea of abducting a girl. What began as fantasy, it appeared, had at some stage crossed the invisible and terrible line into planning. Becky, small and 16 and living under the same family roof by circumstance of marriage, had become the object of that plan. Thursday, the 19th of February 2015, began as a school morning. Darren Galsworthy left the house at around 7:30, heading to work. Anja left not long after. The house fell quiet in the way that houses do once parents have gone, a particular kind of stillness that belongs to those early weekday hours when a teenager is left briefly alone. Becky was still at home. She had not been well in recent days, suffering from the kind of minor illness that keeps young people off school and in the comfort of their bedroom. She was dressed for staying and wearing a onesie and a green jumper. Nathan Matthews arrived at Crown Hill that morning. He was not alone. Shauna Hoare was with him, sitting in his car outside as he approached the house. What he had brought with him told the full story of what this visit truly was. Inside a large bag, he carried a stun device, a pair of handcuffs, tape, and a face mask. This was not a casual family visit. It was the arrival of a man who had planned, in deliberate and unhurried detail, to take his 16-year-old stepsister. Matthews entered the house. What happened in those next few minutes? What was said, how Becky responded, whether she understood the danger she was in, cannot be known with complete certainty, because the only people who know the full truth have never told it cleanly. What the evidence makes clear is this: Becky Watts was suffocated in her bedroom. She fought for her life, she fought, and she lost. She was 16 years old. She was still in her pajamas. The morning had barely begun. Matthew's face mask had slipped during a struggle, that Becky had seen his face, that he had panicked and strangled her to stop her from identifying him. After Becky died, Matthews went back to the car. Hoare, who had been waiting outside throughout, now joined him inside the house. The two of them stayed at Crown Hill for several more hours. When Darren and Anja came home, they came home to their own house, walked through the door, moved through the rooms, unaware that their daughter had been killed there that very morning. Matthews and Hoare were present in the house, behaving normally, speaking ordinarily, concealing everything. Later that day, they loaded Becky's body into the boot of Matthews' car and drove her back to Cotton Mill Lane. The disappearance was reported to police the following day. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon of February 20th, the Galsworthy family contacted Avon and Somerset police to say that Becky had not been seen since the morning and could not be reached. Her phone, her laptop, her tablet were all at home. She had taken nothing, packed nothing, told nobody anything. The absence of any goodbye, any message, any explanation meant that from the very first hours of the investigation, something felt profoundly wrong. The police launched an appeal. The family appeared before cameras, their faces raw with fear, pleading for anyone with information about Becky's whereabouts to come forward. Darren Galsworthy spoke in the measured, desperate voice of a parent who does not yet know the truth but has begun, somewhere beneath the surface of hope, to suspect the worst. The community of Bristol responded with remarkable warmth. Volunteers flooded in, leaflets were printed and distributed across the city, and search parties combed parks, alleyways, and railway tracks. For nearly 2 weeks, the question hanging over the city was the same: where is Becky? The answer was already in a house a mile and a half away. The morning after the murder, Nathan Matthews had gone shopping. He walked into a B&Q hardware store in Horfield, Bristol, and purchased a circular saw, along with face masks, gloves, and protective goggles. He also visited a local 99p store and later a Sainsbury's, where he bought tape and cling film. Every item was recorded by store surveillance cameras, every transaction traceable. He was buying with methodical patience the tools he needed to make Becky disappear. Over the following days, in the bathroom of their home on Cotton Mill Lane, Matthews and Hoare dismembered Becky's body. They cut her into 8 pieces, wrapped each part in cling film, and placed them into suitcases and a plastic storage box. All the while, they continued to participate in the public search for Becky. Matthews attended family gatherings. He spoke to investigators. He looked Becky's grieving father in the eye. For nearly 2 weeks, while Becky's family appeared before cameras, begging the public for help finding a girl who was already gone. It was their phones that began to unravel everything. As the investigation intensified, detectives began examining the digital trail left by those closest to Becky. On February 28th, 9 days after the disappearance, Matthew's car was found outside the home of Hoare's mother in Southmead. That same day, Matthews and Hoare were arrested on suspicion of kidnap. They gave their accounts calmly, consistently. Too consistently, investigators felt, as though the stories had been rehearsed. On March 2nd, they were rearrested and the charge was upgraded to suspicion of murder. On March 2nd, Matthews provided a written statement to police that would later be read aloud in court. A statement he refused to hear, reportedly placing his fingers in his ears as it was read, blocking out the sound of his own words. It stated, in flat and chilling language, that he accepted responsibility for the death of Rebecca Watts on the 19th of February. It described what he had brought to the house. It described, in the distancing, passive language of a man avoiding his own reflection, the sequence of events that had ended a 16-year-old's life. The following day, March 3rd, 2015, police officers attending a property in Barton Court, Barton Hill, a short distance from Cotton Mill Lane, opened a shed. Inside, they found what had been done to Becky Watts: suitcases and a plastic box, 8 packages wrapped in cling film. The detail of discovery was described, months later in a courtroom, as like the worst of all horror movies. Several police officers who attended the scene required counseling in the aftermath. On March 4th, Nathan Matthews was formally charged with murder. 6 more individuals were subsequently arrested and charged with assisting an offender, accused of having helped to conceal or move the packages containing Becky's remains. The investigation had expanded from a missing person case to a murder inquiry to a conspiracy that had reached beyond the 2 people at its center. The trial of Nathan Matthews and Shauna Hoare opened on October 6, 2015, at Bristol Crown Court, before Mr. Justice Dingemans, in the full glare of national media attention. For 5 weeks, the jury heard the architecture of the crime assembled piece by piece. The evidence from the hardware stores, the forensic findings from Cotton Mill Lane, the digital records, the police interviews, the medical examiner's testimony. The prosecution's case was direct and devastating. Becky had been suffocated in her bedroom as part of a kidnap plot driven by Matthews' sexual fixation with petite teenage girls. A fixation whore had come to share. After her death, the prosecution argued, Matthews had stabbed Becky 15 times, and then the two of them had carried out the dismemberment together, over several days, while simultaneously maintaining the pretense of being concerned family members participating in the search. Material recovered from their home, including a video about the sexual assault of a teenager found on a laptop, confirmed the nature of the motivation behind the crime. Matthews, in the witness box, offered a different account. He said he had not intended to kill Becky. He said his plan had been only to kidnap her briefly and frighten her into behaving better toward the family. He said that when his face mask slipped during the struggle and Becky saw his face, panic overtook him. He claimed to have acted largely alone when it came to what followed, saying that Hoare had not been present in the room when Becky died and had not been a willing participant in the disposal of the body. He said he had closed his eyes while using the circular saw, a detail that the prosecutor addressed directly and pointedly, asking the jury to consider what it meant that a man claimed not to know what his own hands were doing. Hoare's defense was simpler. She said she had known nothing. She had been in the car, then asleep, then shocked, then too afraid. She positioned herself as a young woman, pregnant, frightened, and dominated, who had been pulled along by a partner whose actions she had not anticipated and could not control. The prosecution systematically dismantled both accounts. A person who arrives at a home with a bag containing a stun device, handcuffs, and tape is not a person improvising. A person who goes shopping for a circular saw the morning after a death is not a person in shock. A person who wraps evidence in cling film and hides it in a shed is not a person who has lost control. And a couple who jointly sits with a grieving family and speaks to police for nearly 2 weeks, performing normalcy, performing grief, is not two people operating independently of each other. On November 10, 2015, the jury returned their verdicts. Nathan Matthews was found guilty of murder. Shauna Hoare was found guilty of manslaughter, the jury accepting that she had participated in a kidnap in which any reasonable person would have known harm would result, even if the jury did not accept that she had been a full architect of the killing. Both were also found guilty of conspiracy to kidnap. 2 days later, on November 12th, Bristol Crown Court prepared for sentencing. Becky's family filled one side of the gallery. Matthews and Hoare were brought up from the cells. And then something happened that nobody in the courtroom had expected, something that reporters who had covered hundreds of trials said they had never witnessed before. The judge wept. Mr. Justice Dingemans, a senior jurist, a man trained in the measured language of legal proceedings, broke down as he spoke of what had been done to Rebecca Watts. He gathered himself and continued, but the tears said what the law, in all its formal precision, could never fully express. That what had happened to this 16-year-old girl was beyond the ordinary vocabulary of wickedness. That it belonged to a category of cruelty that even the most experienced among us struggle to process without grief. In his remarks, the judge confirmed what the evidence had established, that Nathan Matthews had developed a fixation with having sex with petite teenage girls, and that Becky's kidnap had been planned for a sexual purpose. He described the deception practiced on Becky's father and stepmother as particularly cruel and unusual. The calculated normalcy of two people who had murdered and dismembered a child continuing to attend family dinners and speak to the media, while what they had done to her remained hidden in a shed. He said that both defendants had given obviously dishonest accounts to the court, that neither had truthfully explained what had happened in that bedroom, and that he understood entirely why Becky's family found that frustrating. Because the family deserved the truth. Becky deserved the truth, and the truth was the one thing that Nathan Matthews, even in the end, would not give. Nathan Matthews was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 33 years. He was 28 years old at sentencing, meaning he would be at least 61 years old before he could even be considered for release. Shauna Hoare was sentenced to 17 years. Becky's family, who had sat through 5 weeks of a trial that had laid out in graphic, relentless detail what had been done to their daughter, wept and held one another as the sentences were delivered. In the chaos of emotion that followed in the courtroom hallway, they spoke briefly to waiting press. There were no words that were adequate. There never are. There is a particular quality to cases like Becky Watts that makes them linger in the mind long after the verdict has been delivered and the courtroom has emptied. It is not simply the horror of the crime, though that horror is real and deep and not easily forgotten. It is the betrayal. Becky Watts was killed by a person who shared her family's name. She was taken in a house she considered home, in a room she slept in every night, by someone she had known her entire adolescent life. She died on a Thursday morning in February, still wearing the comfortable clothes of a sick day at home, in the place where she was supposed to be safest in all the world. She was then hidden, her remains packaged and concealed, while her father went on television to beg strangers for help finding her. She was 16 years old. She was just beginning. The judge who sentenced her killer said as much, that Becky had been just beginning to enjoy her teenage years when her life was ended. She had friends who mourned her. She had a father and a stepmother who had sat through the unsurvivable and survived it anyway, because grief, despite everything, does not have an exit. The murder of Becky Watts became one of the most significant criminal cases in Bristol's history, not because of its complexity, but because of its intimacy. Because the greatest horrors are not always those committed by strangers in dark alleys. Sometimes they are committed by people who know your name, who have sat at your table, who drive past your street. Sometimes the danger comes from inside the family home, wearing an ordinary face. Becky Watts deserved a life. She deserved, at the very least, the chance to grow up, to discover who she would become, to know what it felt like to be safe in her own house. She was denied every one of those things. What remains, in the end, is her face in a photograph, small and bright-eyed, smiling a smile that seemed to hold something warm and private, and the knowledge that those who loved her have carried the weight of February 19th, 2015, every single day since. She was just beginning. Story 5. The summer of 2002 settled over Topeka, Kansas, the way it always did, slowly, like a heavy quilt drawn over the flatlands, pressing warmth into the concrete and the cottonwood trees. Topeka is the kind of American city where neighbors still wave from their porches, where the streets carry the names of trees and presidents, and where a Sunday afternoon barbecue can feel like the whole world is in order. It was against this backdrop of ordinary Midwestern life that, on the morning of the 7th of July, 2002, a retired detective named Harold Warswick rang the doorbell of his daughter's home and received no answer. He stood for a moment, perhaps listening for footsteps on the stairs, for the rustle of someone waking. Nothing came. He walked around to the back of the house, noticed a sliding door left open. Unusual, but not alarming, not yet, and let himself inside. He called his daughter's name. Silence. He moved through the familiar rooms of a home he knew well, toward the basement stairs, and there, at the bottom of the steps, in the pale half-light of a July morning, he saw Karen. Harold Warswick, a man who had spent his working life seeing difficult things, needed only a single glance. "Oh, Christ," he said. He knew she was dead. Then he found Mike, lying on the outside of the bed. He called 911 with the voice of a father undone. Karen Harkness was 53 years old when she died. She was warm-hearted, professionally accomplished, working in the hospitality industry, and beloved by her children, Chad and Aaron, who would spend the next 2 decades describing her as a woman who had no enemies. "My mom was an amazing woman," her daughter Erin Sutton would later say. "She didn't have enemies." Mike Sisko was 47, a salesperson for a welding company, who came alive in the company of people who loved him. His son Dustin would speak of him with unguarded tenderness. "My dad was really my life growing up. He was really my hero." The couple had found each other after the wreckage of earlier marriages, 2 people in their middle years who had been given a second chance at happiness and had seized it with both hands. They had been together 4 years. The night before their deaths, surveillance cameras at a casino about an hour outside of Topeka caught them laughing, leaning into each other, living with the ease of people who felt safe. They had stopped for coffee on the way home, the last time either of them was seen alive on camera. Family members were due to gather at Karen's house the very next day. Some of them suspected Mike was going to ask Karen to marry him. When Detective Richard Vall of the Topeka Police Department arrived at the scene, just after 2 in the afternoon on the 7th of July, he was looking at what he would later describe as an emotional execution. 5 bullets had struck Karen Harkness, including in her back, suggesting she may have been trying to move away or had been shot from behind. Mike Cisco had suffered between 5 and 7 gunshot wounds. Both had been in bed. Nothing else in the house had been disturbed. More than $1,000 in cash was left untouched. A Rolex watch sat on a nightstand. Jewelry gleamed where it had been left. This was not a robbery. This was personal. Every investigation begins with the question of who would want the victims dead, and in Topeka that July, the answer surfaced quickly, offered by the grieving families before detectives had even finished documenting the scene. Mike Cisco's sister Kathy Boots said the name without hesitation. His brother-in-law Mark Boots said it too. And then, in the hours following the murders, Detective Vall picked up his phone and called the number he had been given for Mike's ex-wife, a woman named Dana Chandler, to inform her that Mike was dead. She did not ask how. She did not ask where. She did not ask whether the children were safe. Vall would say later that she did not seem particularly concerned. Chandler would say later that she had been very upset, and that the conversation had been deeply distressing. Only Vall's side of the call had been recorded, due to what he described as a technical error on his part. The next evening, Chandler called the Topeka Police Department directly, leaving a message on an officer's voicemail asking them to confirm whether her ex-husband had really been killed. Dana Chandler and Mike Cisco had been married for 15 years. They had 2 children together, a daughter, Haley, and a son, Dustin. Their divorce had been finalized in 1998, and from the moment the paperwork was signed, the relationship had not grown quieter or more civil. It had grown something else entirely. Family members described a pattern of behavior that began as troubling and escalated, over the years, into something they could only call obsessive. Chandler had a drinking problem, they said. She showed up at Mike's home without warning, at strange hours, for reasons that made little sense. One night, Kathy Boots woke at Mike's house to an unusual sound coming from the backyard. She looked through the blinds and saw Dana Chandler jumping on the trampoline in the dark. She had driven to his home in the middle of the night, for no apparent reason, and was bouncing in the shadows alone. It was the kind of incident that was hard to explain to police, too strange to fit neatly into a report, but too real to dismiss. The incidents were numerous enough that Mike Cisco had begun writing them down in a day planner, as if keeping a record for a day when he might need to prove something. One entry from July 28, 1998, reads like a quiet cry for help. Dana stalking neighborhood at 8:30 caught her, she left. Another, from November, notes that she had entered his home while he was at Karen's house, going through his belongings. Mark Boots, Mike's brother-in-law, watched all of this and understood it in a way that frightened him. She was willing to travel great distances to show up back in his life, he said. In the spring of 2002, according to Kathy Boots, Dana had appeared at Mike's door once more, this time suggesting that the children were getting older and had different needs, and proposing that she and Mike resume living together. Mike had declined, and then 9 days before the murders, Mike Cisco said something to Mark Boots while they were out fishing together. They were on the water, in the peace of an ordinary Kansas afternoon, and Mike turned and said, "Mark, you're gonna wake up and find me dead. And I want you to know who did it, Dana Chandler." In the 6 months leading up to the murders of Mike Cisco and Karen Harkness, Dana Chandler had called the 2 of them more than 600 times. Investigators found the records, and witnesses filled in the detail of what those calls were like. Karen Harkness's colleague Kim warned or testified that Karen came to work after sleepless nights, having received calls throughout the dark hours. She had been up all night, receiving phone calls from Dana. She was very afraid. Erin Sutton, Karen's daughter, said her mother told her about the messages that had been left, voice messages full of cruelty, of names designed to wound. On June 3rd of 2002, alone, an FBI analyst testified that Chandler made 17 calls in 18 minutes. Then the calls stopped. Not because the problem resolved itself, but because for 27 hours during the weekend of the murders, Dana Chandler's mobile phone showed no activity at all. Detective Vall noted it when he reviewed her phone records, and the absence hit him as hard as any clue he had ever found. A woman who used her phone constantly, habitually, through every ordinary hour of her days, a woman who made 17 calls in 18 minutes, had simply gone silent for an entire day and night at the precise moment that Mike Cisco and Karen Harkness were shot to death in their bed. Chandler lived in Denver, Colorado. It was approximately 8 hours from Topeka, Kansas by car. When Detective Vall asked her what she had been doing that weekend, she told him she had been home in her Denver apartment on the Saturday evening, the night of the murders, and had gone for a drive in the mountains on the Sunday morning. She mentioned stopping at several stores to run errands. Vall went through her credit card receipts. Most of the purchases were what she described: cigarettes, snacks, a car cigarette lighter. But there was one purchase she had not mentioned: 2 5-gallon gas cans, bought from an AutoZone store. Investigators calculated that 10 gallons of extra fuel would be enough for an extended road trip, or for someone who needed to drive a long distance without stopping at petrol stations where they might be seen or recorded. When they checked the Rocky Mountain National Park surveillance cameras for footage of the drive through the mountains that Chandler described, frame by careful frame, there was no sign of her car. There was also no way to confirm she had been in her apartment. No neighbors had seen her. No friends had spoken with her. Not a single call had been made or received by her phone from the time she went quiet to the time she came back. It was, as the detectives noted, a 27-hour window that swallowed everything. Among all the people whose lives were shattered on the 7th of July, 2002, none carried a more complicated grief than Haley Seal, who was 17 years old when her father was killed. Haley was Dana Chandler's daughter. She was also Mike Cisco's daughter. She sat at the exact, terrible junction of the two families, and she knew what she believed. She had watched her mother's behavior with growing alarm for years. She remembered being driven to her father's house as a small child and told to be a little helper, to look in through the windows and tell her mother what she saw inside. She remembered her mother asking whether there was a woman with her father. In 2005, 3 years after the murders, Haley began secretly recording her own conversations with Dana Chandler. She was not a detective. She was not trained in evidence gathering. She was a young woman who needed to know whether her mother had killed her father, and she could think of no other way to find out. The recorded conversations are extraordinary documents of a relationship under impossible strain. In one exchange, Haley pressed her mother directly, asking whether she could just tell her the truth so they could move forward. Dana's reply was denial. But in another conversation, something else slipped through. Dana Chandler, speaking in the casual intimacy of a private phone call, told her daughter, "I said I could kill him. You ever think about killing him?" "I did. Honestly, I can say I did." She framed it as passing frustration, the kind of thing anyone might say. But the words sat between them, not quite explained, not quite forgotten. As for Haley's brother Dustin, he was equally certain. He testified that his mother had driven him and his sister out on surveillance runs, watching their father's house from the car. "She told us, we're just going to be her little helpers," Dustin said in court. For nearly a decade after the murders, the case sat in an agonizing limbo. Detective Vall had a suspect. The families had a conviction. But the Shawnee County District Attorney at the time, Robert Hecht, looked at the evidence and made a difficult, honest assessment. Without the murder weapon, without DNA, without fingerprints, he could not take the case to a jury. Kathy Boots, Mike's sister, could not accept this. She and her mother Carol drove around searching for clues, lifting manhole covers, checking the ceilings of motorway service station bathrooms, looking for a gun that Dana Chandler might have discarded on a drive back to Denver. They found nothing, but they did not stop. The families pushed and pushed. They requested meetings with the DA. They conducted their own investigations. They carried their grief through years that refused to offer them anything in return. In 2007, forensic homicide consultant Vernon Gaberth, a former New York City Police Department detective, reviewed the case files and issued a formal report concluding that Dana Chandler was the one and only person who had the motive, means, and opportunity to commit these murders. Then, in 2011, a new district attorney named Chad Taylor took office in Shawnee County. He looked at the same evidence that had sat in files for 9 years, and he made a different decision. He was willing to take the risk. On July 24, 2011, she was taken into custody and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. In March 2012, Dana Chandler went on trial in Topeka. The courtroom was quiet in the way that serious places become quiet, a heavy, watching silence. Her children sat on opposite sides of the courtroom divide because her children had chosen sides. Prosecutor Jackie Spradling opened with the taped conversations, playing Dana Chandler's own voice for the jury. "I could kill him. I thought about killing him." She walked the jury through the pattern of 600 phone calls, the gas cans, the silent phone, the dry run into Topeka a month before the murders. The night Dana had told a friend she had climbed through a window into Mike's house to look around, and had then driven to Karen Harkness's house and sat outside waiting, though they never came home. Defense attorney Mark Bennett pushed back hard on every point. There was no forensic evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, no murder weapon, not a single eyewitness who could put Dana Chandler inside the state of Kansas. The closest police had come was a gas station clerk in Waukene, a small town roughly halfway between Denver and Topeka, who, when shown a photograph, said she was 70% sure she had seen Chandler the night of the murders. By the time the trial began, the clerk had died, and her certainty could never be tested. The jury deliberated for 83 minutes. They returned a verdict of guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. When it was Dana Chandler's turn to speak at sentencing, she looked at the court and said, "I deny that I murdered Mike or Karen. I am innocent. I did not murder Mike or Karen." She was sentenced to life in prison. For 6 years, the case appeared to be settled. Dana Chandler sat in prison. The families tried, in whatever way they could manage, to rebuild. And then, in 2018, the Kansas Supreme Court dismantled everything. An appeals investigation had uncovered something that could not be overlooked or excused. Prosecutor Jackie Spradling, during the 2012 trial, had told the jury that Mike Sisko had obtained a formal protection from abuse order against Dana Chandler, that a judge had reviewed the situation and agreed she needed to be kept away from him. It was a powerful and deeply persuasive moment in her closing arguments. And it was not true. No such order had ever been issued. Chandler's appeals attorney Stacy Schlimmer searched the entire court record. There was nothing. Spradling had also described a specific route that Chandler had allegedly taken on her drive back from Topeka through Nebraska, and there was no evidence for that either. The Kansas Supreme Court, reviewing the totality of Spradling's conduct, described her actions as intolerable acts of deception aimed at the jury and the courts. Jackie Spradling was disbarred. The conviction was overturned. Dana Chandler, after 6 years in prison, was legally declared to have had an unfair trial. Haley Seal heard the news and stood motionless in the shock of it. What does this mean? Will the DA's office retry her? She already knew what the answer needed to be. The new district attorney, McKe, looked at the case, the evidence, the families, the years of grief, and chose to try Dana Chandler a second time. The second trial began in July 2022. Dana Chandler had been in custody for more than a decade when she finally walked into a Kansas courtroom again, this time with a different defense attorney. The absence of any physical evidence remained the immovable centerpiece of the defense. No DNA, no fingerprints, no weapon, no witness who could place her in Kansas. Defense attorney Tom Bath told the jury that everything they had heard was circumstantial at best, and that the state had never, in 20 years of trying, managed to put Dana Chandler inside Karen Harkness's home on the night of the murders. Deputy DA Charles Kitt stood before the jury and said something rare for a prosecutor to acknowledge so plainly. Science is not going to solve this case. This case is not based on DNA. He argued instead that the case was built on jealousy, rage, and obsession, that these things had a weight and a reality of their own, even without a fingerprint. The jury deliberated for 6 days. They could not agree. 7 voted to convict, 5 voted to acquit, and the judge declared a mistrial. After more than a decade of incarceration, Dana Chandler's bond was reduced, and she was released from jail, fitted with GPS monitoring, and sent back into the world while a 3rd trial was scheduled. The 3rd trial, moved at the defense's request to Pottawatomie County, 60 miles from Topeka, began in February 2025. And on the morning that opening statements were scheduled, Dana Chandler stood up and dismissed her attorneys. She announced that she would represent herself. Over the weeks that followed, the courtroom became something almost unprecedented. A mother cross-examining her own daughter about the murder of her own father. Haley Seal took the stand for the 3rd time and testified against the woman who had given birth to her. Her brother Dustin did the same. Both of them, now adults in their late 30s, believed without reservation that their mother had killed their father and Karen Harkness. They both faced questions asked directly by Dana Chandler. "It was the most awful thing I've ever experienced," Haley told. "The suspect in the killing of my dad is now having the power to question me on the stand and talk to me. Not just the suspect in the killing of my dad, my own mother." Dana Chandler, conducting her own defense, testified for approximately 20 hours spread across 7 days. She told the jury that no one could place her at the scene, that she had never owned a 9mm firearm, that she was not in Topeka on the night in question, and that she had never been in the state of Kansas on July 7, 2002. She was composed, methodical, and unwavering. "My liberty, my freedom is hanging in the balance," she told the jury. Deputy DA Charles Kitt told the jury, once again, about the obsessive phone calls, the gas cans, the silent phone, the dry run, the fear Mike Sisko had expressed to his brother-in-law 9 days before his death. He told them that Dana Chandler had killed Mike Sisko and Karen Harkness because she had lost control of the man she had once been married to, and she could not bear it. The jury deliberated for just under 4 hours. They found Dana Chandler guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. On the 3rd of June, 2025, Judge Cheryl Rios handed down sentence in a courtroom in Shawnee County. Dana Chandler stood and listened as 2 consecutive life terms were imposed. 1 for Mike Sisko, 1 for Karen Harkness. She would not be eligible for parole for 50 years, with credit for the 13 years she had already served. Dana Chandler did not confess. She stood and, for the 3rd time in a courtroom, in the same composed, absolute voice she had always used, said, "I have always maintained my innocence. I continue to maintain my innocence. I was not in Topeka, Kansas, on July 7th. I never owned or possessed a 9mm firearm. What is happening in this courtroom is a grave injustice. I was not the one who killed them." The judge imposed the maximum. The case of Dana Chandler spans 23 years. From the morning Harold Warswick rang his daughter's doorbell in Topeka to the June afternoon when a judge closed a chapter that had been open since the summer of 2002. It unfolded across 3 trials, 2 convictions, 1 overturn, 1 hung jury, 1 disbarred prosecutor, and a family that spent more than 2 decades sitting in courtrooms, reliving the worst morning of their lives. Haley Seal said after the 3rd verdict that she hoped the victims would not be forgotten in the noise of the legal saga that surrounded their deaths. "I feel like the focus of this case has gone almost completely to Dana Chandler," she said, "and that the victims and the families of the victims has really been lost in this case, which is really sad." Karen Harkness was a woman her daughter wanted to become. Mike Sisko was a man his son called his hero. They had spent their last evening at a casino, laughing, leaning into each other, making plans that included an engagement and a family gathering, and all the ordinary things that people plan when they expect to grow older. Their murders were never about them. They were about the person who could not let go of a life that had already ended. and the murder weapon has never been found. Somewhere out there, on a road between Denver and Topeka, or in a landfill, or in a river, the 9mm gun that ended 2 lives on a July morning in Kansas remains where Dana Chandler left it. The family searched for it. Investigators looked for it. It is the one piece of the puzzle that has never surfaced, the one element of the story that remains, even now, unanswered, a small, silent absence in a case already full of them. Story 6. There is a particular kind of loneliness that settles over a small prairie town in Colorado in the hours before sunrise. Lochbuie is the kind of place where the streets are quiet by 9 at night, where neighbors know each other's vehicles by sound, and where the endless stretch of the high plains sky can make a person feel both free and utterly exposed. It was here, in a modest house on Poplar Street, that a 56-year-old woman named Terry Acriman spent the last hours of her known life. And it was here, 7 years later, that the truth about what happened to her was finally, heartbreakingly unearthed. Not by the authorities who had searched for her, but by a man clearing boxes from a cluttered garage. Terry was not a complicated woman in the way that people sometimes use the word as a euphemism for difficult. She was warm and gentle, the kind of woman who found genuine pleasure in small things. A good book, a favorite television program, a song she loved playing in the background while she puttered around the house. She had served in the military, a chapter of her life that had carried her to Maryland, where she met a man named Delbert Acriman. They married on March 21st, 2011, and for a time, there may have been hope in that union. But marriages, like houses, sometimes reveal their cracks slowly. By the time Terry understood the nature of the walls that surrounded her, they had already begun to close in. Delbert, who went by the nickname Dale, was a man with a forceful presence. After the couple moved from Maryland to Lochbuie, Colorado, Terry's family began to notice changes in her. She grew quieter, more careful with her words, more hesitant. Her daughter, Amber Carolus, would later describe what her mother had confided to her in painful detail. Delbert would tell Terry she was useless, that she was nothing without him, that she would never survive financially on her own. He would go silent for long stretches, using his coldness as a weapon until Terry, desperate to restore peace to the home, would find herself apologizing for things that were never her fault in the first place. When Delbert drank, the cruelty became more pointed. Terry told Amber she felt afraid in her own home, not in an abstract way, but in the deeply personal, bone-level way that only comes from living with someone whose moods you must constantly monitor. Delbert had a son named Christopher, and Terry had told family members that she felt unsafe around him as well. The house on Poplar Street, by any honest accounting, did not feel like a sanctuary. Then came a moment that changed everything. A few months before August 2018, Terry had been found unconscious in her home and was taken to the hospital by ambulance. The cause was never clearly established. When she recovered and returned home, she and Delbert argued. In the heat of that argument, Delbert looked at his wife and said, "I wish she would have just died." It was the kind of sentence that cannot be unsaid, the kind that reverberates long after the voice has gone quiet. Amber knew, after hearing those words, that her mother had to leave. She began helping Terry plan her exit in secret, understanding intuitively that informing Delbert of the plan before it was fully realized would only make things more dangerous. Terry opened a new bank account. She researched state assistance programs. She confided in Geraldine Contreras, the mother of Jesse, who was engaged to Amber, and Geraldine had offered Terry a place to stay. Escape was not just a hope anymore. It was a plan in motion. The door was nearly open. August 23rd, 2018 was a Tuesday. By most accounts, it was an ordinary afternoon. Terry spent part of her day at Amber's home, visiting with her daughter and her grandchildren, whom she adored. Her granddaughter Amriana later remembered that Terry was in a fairly good mood that afternoon. She smiled, said her goodbyes, and climbed into her car for the 20 to 30-minute drive back to Lochbuie. At 4:30 in the afternoon, she called Amber to let her know she had arrived home safely. It was the kind of routine check-in that a mother makes a small act of reassurance exchanged between two people who loved each other. Amber was a 911 dispatcher, and she was due to start a shift at 3 o'clock in the morning. This meant that Terry, who typically watched Amber's children at least 3 days a week, would have needed to arrive at Amber's home by 2:30 in the morning to be there when her daughter left for work. It was a tiring arrangement, but Terry did it gladly. The grandchildren were her world. A couple of hours after that 4:30 call, the phone rang again. It was Terry, but the warmth of the afternoon had shifted into something unrecognizable. She was crying. Her voice was tight with distress. She told Amber she could not watch the children the next day. She had not slept, and she was exhausted. She asked, through tears, whether Amber was angry with her. Amber, steady and gentle the way that daughters of difficult households often learn to be, told her mother not to worry. "Go shower and go to bed," she said. "I'll figure it out." That was the last time Amber ever heard her mother's voice. She did not know it then. She assumed her mother would do exactly as she had said: shower, go to bed, rest. Jessie took the following day off work to watch the children in Terry's place. Amber went to her shift at the dispatch center, trusting in the ordinary rhythms of the day to hold everything together. But something had already gone terribly wrong. At 6 in the morning, Jessie and the children were awakened by a knock at the door. When Jessie opened it, he found Delbert Acriman standing there on the step. Delbert said he had come to watch the children because Terry was unable to. Jessie was confused. This was not how things were done in the family. Changes to arrangements were communicated in advance. No one had called. No one had sent a message. Delbert's sudden presence, before the sun had fully risen, in a neighborhood that was a 30-minute drive from his own home, was strange. What Jessie did not know, and what Amber's granddaughter Amariana would later report, was that Delbert had actually pulled up to the house approximately an hour before knocking. He had sat in his vehicle in the dark, doing something unknown, waiting. Jessie told Delbert he had already taken the day off, and that his help was not needed. Delbert was reluctant to leave. He lingered, stayed until 11 in the morning, made a stop at a marijuana dispensary, returned, helped Jessie fix a section of fence, and then finally drove back to the house on Poplar Street. There was something unsettled in his behavior, a restlessness that the people around him registered, but did not yet understand how to name. That evening, at 8 o'clock, Amber's phone rang. It was Delbert. He told her Terry was missing. He explained that when he had left the house at around 5 in the morning, to drive to Amber's to babysit, he said, Terry had been asleep in bed. When he returned, she was gone. Her phone was on the counter. Her wallet, her keys, her car still there. Her cigarettes, which she would not have willingly left behind, still there. Even her identification. Everything that a person needed to exist in the world, still sitting in that house. Only her medication was missing. Delbert told Amber he had driven around Lochbuie looking for Terry before going to the police station to file a missing person report. Amber found this strange. Terry had no close friends in the area, no family nearby except Amber herself. If Terry had left the house, there was exactly one place she would have gone. Why had Delbert not simply called Amber to ask if her mother was there? Amber drove to the house on Poplar Street. The first thing she noticed was that Delbert's white pickup truck, which was almost always parked in the driveway, was gone. The second thing she noticed was that every single trash can and recycling bin on the property had been emptied. It was not garbage collection day. The investigation that followed was hampered, almost from the beginning, by a combination of limited resources, the challenge of a truly traceless disappearance, and a factor that Terry's family would come to resent deeply: her diagnosis of bipolar disorder. There was a prevailing assumption, the family later said, that Terry had simply gone manic, that she had disappeared by choice, that she was a woman in an unstable mental state who had walked out of her own life. It is a familiar dismissal, one that follows certain kinds of women in certain kinds of circumstances, and it allowed the urgency of the situation to bleed away before the investigation had truly taken hold. Authorities searched the house and the surrounding area. Search and rescue teams were brought in. Cadaver dogs were deployed around the property. Not once, but 3 separate times. They found nothing. Drone operations were conducted. Interviews were carried out. No evidence of foul play was formally identified, and the case was left to grow cold. In the weeks and months that followed, Amber searched relentlessly. She drove across Colorado looking for any trace of her mother. She spoke to the media. She was happy, Amber said. Her family was everything. That makes me believe she just wouldn't do this to us. She reached out to Delbert for help in the searches. Every time he refused. At some point, Delbert agreed to take a polygraph test. Before he did, he told Amber something chilling, that he knew how to beat it. The results of the test were never made public. Delbert's son Christopher was also asked to take a polygraph. He refused entirely. In the weeks after Terry vanished, Amber drove unannounced to the house on Poplar Street. She found Delbert and Christopher sitting together, deep in conversation. When they saw her come through the door, their talking stopped immediately. Christopher stood up without a word and left the room. There was nothing illegal about the scene, nothing that could be pointed to as proof of anything. But there is a particular stillness that descends over a room when people have been speaking about something they do not wish to be heard, and Amber recognized it. Delbert's white pickup remained a point of interest. When asked about it, Delbert told police it was at the car repair business he owned, being repaired for dents. When the truck was returned a few days later, it was still covered in dents. The family does not know whether investigators ever followed up on the auto shop to confirm Delbert's story. The years passed. The case did not close, but it did not move either. Terry's photograph circulated online, shared by her family and by true crime communities who kept her name alive in threads and posts and discussions. Her daughter Amber never stopped looking, never stopped talking, never stopped demanding that the world remember a woman who had simply been erased. In February 2025, Delbert Acriman died of cancer. He was 70 years old. He died without having been formally charged with anything. He died in the same town, possibly in the same house, where his wife had last been seen alive. He carried with him, into death, whatever it was he knew. After Delbert passed, his son Sean inherited the property on Poplar Street. The house had fallen into serious disrepair. Sean walked through it and found, as he later described, a place that seemed frozen in 2018. None of Terry's belongings had been touched. Her clothing was where she had left it. The items on her side of the bed had not been moved. Delbert had apparently slept on his half of the bed for 7 years, leaving the other half exactly as it was on the night his wife disappeared. Her photographs still hung on the walls. All of her clothing was exactly where it was, Sean said. Everything that she had on the bed was still on the bed. He still slept on half a bed that he hadn't cleaned for 7 years. Her pictures were there, everything was there. Sean determined that the property was in too poor a condition to do anything with before a major clean-out. He arranged for a contact to come to the house on September 10th, 2025, to remove scrap metal and junk. The man arrived and opened up the garage. The garage was a claustrophobic space, packed from floor to ceiling with boxes. The air inside reeked of cat urine. The man began to work his way through the mess, pulling things aside, navigating the narrow paths between stacked cardboard. 3 feet into the accumulated clutter, he found a bone. He paused. Around the property, there were Halloween decorations, plastic and foam skeletons arranged around the yard, the kind that Delbert had apparently put up at some point and never taken down. The man initially wondered whether the bone was part of one of those decorations, an artificial thing mixed in with the debris. It was not. When officers from the Lockview Police Department arrived and began their investigation, they found human remains on the property at 130 Poplar Street. In the weeks that followed, those remains were identified by the Weld County coroner as belonging to Terry and Acriman. She had been in that garage, 3 feet behind a wall of boxes, in the house she had shared with her husband, on the property that had been searched by cadaver dogs 3 separate times, for 7 years. The cadaver dogs had circled the home. The investigators had walked the grounds. And Terry had been there, hidden not far from where she was last seen alive, waiting to be found. The The biggest thing that doesn't make sense to anybody, Sean said, is how cadaver dogs were out there 3 times and missed a body that was on the other side of a very thin piece of metal. The autopsy was conducted, but as of early 2026, its results have not been made public. The cause and manner of Terry's death remain officially undetermined in public record. The Lockbury Police Department has stated that the case is actively being investigated and is urging anyone with information to come forward. There are no confirmed arrests, no formal charges, no public declaration of what happened in that house in the final hours of August 23, 2018. Delbert Acriman, the man whom Terry's family has long pointed to as the central figure of suspicion, is gone. He died before the woman he had shared a home with was found. Whatever he knew, whatever he did, whatever truths he buried beneath those boxes alongside her remains, those truths belong to him now, and to silence. Terry's family launched a fundraiser after her remains were found. The words written on that page are simple and devastating. After 7 years, this journey of looking for Terry is finally over, as we can finally receive closure and the justice she's deserved. But closure and justice are not the same thing. Closure is the body found. Justice is the truth acknowledged, the responsibility named, the account settled. Terry and Acriman's family has arrived at the painful middle ground between the two. The grief confirmed, the mystery not yet fully resolved. Terry loved books. She loved music. She loved sitting with her grandchildren and being, in the way that grandmothers are, a steady presence in the lives of small people who needed one. She was in the process of leaving a dangerous situation. She had a plan, a bank account, a friend who had offered her a room, a daughter who was helping her in secret. She was, by every account of those who loved her, a woman who was trying. She deserved to walk out that door. The investigation continues. The garage on Poplar Street is empty now, and somewhere in the machinery of law enforcement and forensic science, the question of what truly happened to Terry and Acriman remains open, waiting, as she waited, for someone to look closely enough to find the truth. Story 7. The summer sun hung heavy over Bel Air, Maryland, on the 5th day of August 2023, casting long shadows across the Ma and Pa Heritage Trail. This winding path, a beloved stretch of former railroad corridor transformed into a green sanctuary for walkers, runners, and cyclists, snaked through woodlands and past quiet subdivisions in Harford County. For 37-year-old Rachel Morren, a mother of 5 children, this trail represented something precious, a moment of peace carved from the demands of daily life, a place where she could breathe, move, and find clarity. On this particular August evening, as the day began its slow descent toward twilight, Rachel laced up her running shoes and set out for what should have been an ordinary jog along her favorite trail. Rachel had spent the day as she typically did, surrounded by the energy and chaos of her children, sharing moments with her boyfriend Richard Tobin, attending to the endless rhythms of family life. The trail represented her sanctuary, a space where the noise fell away and she could simply exist in motion. This time on the trail was her peace, a phrase that would echo with tragic irony in the days and months to come. As Rachel entered the trailhead at Williams Street that evening, her phone and Apple Watch tracking her movements, she could not have known that someone waited in the shadows ahead, concealed in the drainage culverts that ran alongside the path. Victor Antonio Martinez Hernandez, a 23-year-old man from El Salvador, had entered the United States illegally in February 2023. Behind him lay a trail of violence that authorities were only beginning to piece together. A murder in his home country, a brutal home invasion in Los Angeles just weeks after crossing the border, and now, on this August evening in Maryland, he crouched in hiding along the Ma and Pa Trail. He had been living and working in Bel Air, moving through the community undetected, and on this day, for reasons that would forever remain locked in his own cold calculus, he had chosen to wait. The trail, with its tight turns and wooded sections, its bridges and boardwalks winding through areas where civilization gave way to forest, offered the perfect terrain for an ambush. Kyle Stacy was walking the trail that evening with his girlfriend and their dog when they crossed paths with two figures, a woman jogging and a man whose presence would later haunt him. The encounter lasted mere moments, unremarkable at the time. Shortly after Rachel passed him on the trail, she encountered Martinez Hernandez. What happened next, reconstructed through forensic evidence, witness testimony, and the grim findings of investigators, painted a picture of violence so brutal it would shake the entire community to its foundation. Data from Rachel's phone and Apple Watch told a story her voice could not. The devices showed she had been dragged approximately 150 feet from the main path into the dense woods, pulled from the sanctuary of her trail into a nightmare of isolated violence. Martinez Hernandez attacked with a ferocity that defied comprehension, beating her head repeatedly with rocks found at the scene, 10 to 15 times according to medical examiners, striking with such force that a 6 by 6 inch gash opened on the back of her skull, so deep that bone became visible. Rachel fought back with everything she had, but Martinez Hernandez overpowered her, strangling her even as he continued the assault. The violence did not end with her death. While Rachel lay unconscious or dying in those woods, Martinez Hernandez violated her body. When he had finished, he dragged her further into the drainage culverts that ran alongside the trail, concealing her remains in the dark, damp spaces where water flowed beneath the earth. Then he vanished into the gathering darkness, leaving behind only DNA evidence and the shattered fragments of a life brutally stolen. As evening deepened into night, Richard Tobin waited for Rachel to return home. They had only recently made their relationship public, posting about it on social media just days before. Tobin, who had openly acknowledged his troubled past but spoke of 15 months of sobriety and personal transformation, grew increasingly worried as the hours passed without word from Rachel. By 11 o'clock that night, his concern had crystallized into alarm, and he contacted authorities to report her missing. Rachel's car was found at the Williams Street entrance to the trail the following morning, sitting empty as searchers fanned out across the area. At 7 minutes past 1 in the afternoon on August 6th, a member of the public walking near the trail made the discovery that would confirm everyone's worst fears. Rachel's body lay in the wooded area adjacent to the path, and deputies from the Harford County Sheriff's Office quickly declared her death a brutal homicide. The news rippled through Bel Air and beyond, transforming the Mine Pa Trail from a place of peace into a crime scene, from a community asset into a location marked by unspeakable tragedy. For Rachel's 5 children, ranging in age and including one child on the autism spectrum, the world had fundamentally changed. In the aftermath of her murder, the children could no longer remain together under one roof. 2 stayed at the family home, 2 others moved to a different residence miles away, and the oldest went to live with their father. The child with autism struggled particularly hard with the loss, unable to process the sudden absence of their mother. Rachel's mother, Patty Morren, would later speak of the pain as something physical, describing it as if someone came and put their hands into your chest and ripped out your heart. As investigators processed the crime scene, they recovered DNA evidence from multiple locations on Rachel's body. This biological evidence became the key that would eventually unlock the identity of her killer, but the path to that identification would prove long and complex. On August 17, 2023, the Harford County Sheriff's Office reached out to Homeland Security Investigations for assistance. Authorities had determined that their suspect might be connected to another crime, and when they ran the DNA through databases, they found a match that stunned them. The DNA recovered from Rachel Morren's body matched DNA, collected at the scene of a home invasion in Los Angeles in March 2023, just weeks after Martinez Hernandez had illegally entered the United States. During that Los Angeles incident, a mother and her young daughter had been assaulted in their home by an intruder whose violence had been captured on surveillance video. Authorities now had video footage of their suspect and a DNA link connecting him to crimes across the country, but they still did not have his identity. The investigation that followed involved local and federal law enforcement agencies working in concert to identify and locate a suspect who seemed to have disappeared. Sheriff Jeffrey Gollier and his team released surveillance footage from the Los Angeles home invasion, hoping someone would recognize the man in the video. Richard Tobin shared the images on social media, calling the suspect scum of the earth and pleading for justice for Rachel. Months passed, each one adding weight to the grief carried by Rachel's family and deepening the community's sense of violation. Investigators painstakingly built their case, tracking Martinez Hernandez through forensic genealogy, witness statements, and business records. Despite Martinez Hernandez's later claims that he had never been to Maryland, multiple witnesses and employment records confirmed his presence in Bel Air at the time of Rachel's murder. In May 2024, nearly 10 months after Rachel's death, authorities finally identified their suspect. Victor Antonio Martinez Hernandez was not only wanted for Rachel's murder, he was also wanted in El Salvador for the murder of another woman, and authorities suspected him in the Los Angeles assault. On the evening of June 14, 2024, officers from the Tulsa Police Department entered a bar in Oklahoma and found Martinez Hernandez sitting casually, as if he had not left a trail of devastation across multiple states and countries. When officers approached him, he provided false information about his identity and claimed ignorance about why he might be wanted. He was initially detained on a trespassing charge, but when police checked his details more thoroughly, they discovered the Maryland warrant. Martinez Hernandez signed a waiver permitting his extradition back to Maryland, and the legal machinery that would eventually bring him to justice began to turn. The trial began in April 2025, with jury selection followed by opening statements on the 4th of the month. Prosecutors sought life in prison without the possibility of parole, the maximum sentence available since Maryland had abolished capital punishment. The defense denied Martinez Hernandez's involvement and attempted to shift suspicion, suggesting that Rachel had attracted male attention and questioning Richard Tobin, implying he might have been with Rachel on the day of her death. These tactics failed to sway the jury from the mountain of evidence prosecutors presented. The trial laid bare the full horror of what Rachel had endured in her final moments. Dr. Ollie took the stand and detailed the catastrophic injuries inflicted upon her, the fractures, the massive head wound, the evidence of strangulation. Prosecutors presented the DNA evidence that conclusively linked Martinez Hernandez to the crime, evidence so strong that his presence at the scene could not be disputed. They showed the jury images and screenshots found on Martinez Hernandez's phone after his arrest, pictures of Rachel Morren that he had no legitimate reason to possess. Witnesses testified about seeing both Rachel and Martinez Hernandez on the trail that day. The prosecution walked the jury through Rachel's final day, her time with her children and boyfriend, her decision to take a walk on the trail where she found peace, and the unimaginable violence that met her there. On April 14, 2025, after hearing all the evidence, the jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning with their verdict. Victor Antonio Martinez Hernandez was found guilty of first-degree murder, first-degree rape, third-degree physical offense, and kidnapping. The speed of the verdict reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence against him. Rachel's killer had been identified, captured, and convicted, but no verdict could restore what had been taken from her children, her mother, her family, and her community. The sentencing hearing took place on August 11, 2025, and brought with it further revelations about the man who had destroyed so many lives. In a pre-sentencing investigation, a psychologist who evaluated Martinez Hernandez described him as displaying coldness, dismissiveness, and a callous attitude when discussing the offense, along with an absence of remorse, insight, acceptance of responsibility, or empathy. The doctor noted that Martinez Hernandez continued to lie about proven facts and even laughed and cracked jokes during their session, behavior that significantly heightened concerns about his risk of reoffending. This evaluation painted a portrait of someone fundamentally lacking in human empathy, someone for whom the suffering of others registered as nothing more than amusing abstractions. Judge Yolanda Curtin, presiding over the sentencing, called Martinez Hernandez's actions the worst imaginable. She told him directly that he was not a candidate for any rehabilitative sentence. Martinez Hernandez displayed minimal emotion as Judge Curtin imposed life sentences for both the first-degree murder and first-degree rape convictions, along with an additional 40 years for the third-degree physical offense and kidnapping. He would serve his entire sentence in a Maryland correctional facility, removed from society for the remainder of his life. Before the sentence was handed down, Patty Morren addressed the court with a victim impact statement that captured the enduring agony of losing her daughter to such senseless brutality. "The brutality of her murder will haunt us for the rest of our lives," she said, words that echoed the permanent wound left by Rachel's death. No amount of justice could truly heal that wound. No sentence could resurrect the life that had been stolen, but the conviction and sentencing offered a measure of closure, a formal acknowledgement that Rachel Morren mattered, that her life had value, and that her killer would be held accountable. The wooded trail where Rachel had died. The Ma and Pa Heritage Trail continues to wind through Bel Air, and people still walk and run its paths, though the memory of what happened there in August 2023 lingers. Rachel Morren's children continue to grow up without their mother, navigating the world without her guidance, her love, her presence at milestones she will never witness. Patty Morren has spoken about the long road to healing that lies ahead for them, acknowledging that while justice has been served, the loss remains. The trail that was once Rachel's place of peace became the site of her death, but it also became a reminder of her life, of the ordinary moments of grace that violence sought to erase but could never fully destroy. Victor Martinez Hernandez will spend the rest of his life behind bars, but the consequences of his actions extend far beyond his own confinement. 2 families in different countries mourn women he is accused of killing. A mother and daughter in Los Angeles carry the trauma of his assault. 5 children in Maryland grow up without their mother. A community's sense of safety was shattered on a summer evening when a place meant for peace became a scene of horror. These are the true costs of violence, the ripples that spread from a single act of cruelty, touching lives in ways that can never be fully calculated or repaired. Rachel Morren was 37 years old when she died, a mother who found solace in movement, in the quiet of the trail, in the rhythm of her own footsteps carrying her forward. She deserved to watch her children grow, to experience the ordinary joys and struggles that make up a life, to grow old in peace. Instead, she encountered a predator who had already left violence in his wake, and who would continue until he was stopped. Her story is both singular in its horror and tragically familiar in its pattern, a life cut short by someone who saw other human beings as objects to be used and discarded. In the end, justice took the form of a verdict delivered in less than an hour and a sentence that ensured Martinez Hernandez would never again have the opportunity to harm another person. But justice could not restore Rachel to her children, could not erase the trauma of her final moments, could not undo the ripple effects of violence that would touch generations. It could only acknowledge what had been lost and ensure that the person responsible would answer for his actions. For Rachel's family, that acknowledgement mattered, even as they continued to navigate a world forever altered by her absence. The brutality of Rachel Morren's murder haunts those who loved her, just as Patty Morren said it would. But alongside that haunting lives the memory of who Rachel was, a mother of 5, a woman who sought peace on a trail through the woods, a person whose life mattered far beyond the violence that ended it. Her story serves as a reminder of the fragility of safety, the randomness of violence, and the enduring strength of those left behind to carry forward in the wake of unimaginable loss. Victor Martinez Hernandez took Rachel's life, but he could not erase the fact that she lived, that she was loved, and that her absence leaves a void that nothing can fill.